this can be of some use for what we have been talking previously to these days so far regarding to the Indo-European doctrine of struggle and victory. And I think it's important in a universal sense to point this out, what it means to fight and to win in this context. As as Clausewitzians, we know that nothing can be predicted, but there is a mechanism that the ancients had identified that in fact is reflected in the same Clausewitzian theory that doesn't, as there is never certainty of victory, and this is exactly the same reason why there is such a thing like victory and defeat, right? Because if you were certain, you wouldn't even need to fight, right? Or to awaken, as we will see now, your own forces from the within in order to do it, and tending to the infinite, to the utmost sacrifice. So today we'll look at properly at the understanding of the innermost meanings that lie at the base of this concept that we can draw from the classical and Nordic traditions alike. So, as a point of reference, it's necessary here to observe that in these traditions, some precise symbolic images appear with singular frequency. This is probably the most evident thing in ancient art, that said, I can tell it from my personal background, from school or university. Nobody ever told me. Like, it was actually even scattered here and there. It's basically the same, guardian angel and many other related concepts to this, but it was never properly explicitated. That instead is possibly the single most central symbol in the history of the Indo-European culture, or not, right? And that still lives on and lived on, right, for a long time, right? In even in medieval symbolism and beyond. So these are essentially the images of the soul in the guise of whatever you want to call it from the various traditions. Like, it could be a demon, a double, a genius, and the like, right? So it's properly a daimon, so it's a spirit, right? It's an alter ego. It's a spiritual entity. And what this makes it even more fascinating is that they sometimes go in parallel with Dionysian presences of the goddess of death, for example, but especially with the image of the goddess of victory, who often also appears in the form of the goddess of battle. And I've been using, not generally just in this video, but many others, like properly the archetypical Indo-European heroic model. It's the warrior on chariot, essentially surmounted by this angel, this winged female, because it's mostly a female figure, and we'll explain now why, because that's also particularly important. That leads them fundamentally to victory, because she is victory herself, and she is the warrior soul itself. So you immediately understand here the connection that is formed between the warrior elevation to deity in heroic form that is achieved through battle. And in order to exactly understand the relationships between this spirit, the individual, and the victory, it is first of all necessary to clarify the meaning of this soul, of this spirit, understood as a demon, genius, or alter ego. So, in ancient times, the demon or alter ego symbolized a force lying in depth, that is to speak, the life of life. Basically, this soul guides all the bodily and spiritual events of the individual, right? Which the normal consciousness, the voluntary one, essentially does not reach, right? It's a subconscious and superior, essentially, force. So it, however, influences the contingent existence altogether and the destiny of the individual to a very high degree, as you understand. So it's an element that, as we will see now, is connected actually very closely to the mystical forces of the individual's stock and blood, where the individual originates. Thus, for example, the soul appears in many ways similar to the one of the Lares in the Etruscan and eventually Latin religion. So these are the mystical entities of a lineage of progeny, right? As Macrobius, for example, puts it, quote, "There are gods who keep us alive. They feed our body and guide our soul." So you see also in the Lares there is, because later Roman civilization gave us this enormous archaeological amount of statues, etc., representing the Lares, and some of them are differentiated. There were a multitude of them, by the way. They weren't just a single thing, and they of course accompanied every individual in a different way. So that's why they also take, in this case, less kind of warrior-like outlook, because kind of the Roman population at that point was less militarized than, say, the average tribesman, or even in some feudal cultures like the Persian one was. So we'll see that the Indo-German tradition displayed at some levels properly a more markedly military and also properly especially, at least, well, in the Nordic case, a female phase, and this was probably present at the root of Indo-European culture in the same way. But they are exactly the same thing. So this is a soul that nurtures us, right, and determines us in a way, so that even in the Nordic tradition, this change from a kind of force that, as we'll see now, was tamed to something that in a sense increasingly determined the existence of the individual, right, and its destiny. So there was something heroic, you understanding here, in essentially going beyond your destiny, going over it. And this is quite important. If you remember that video we made about the Fortuna Caesaris, right, we have seen how fundamentally the fortuna in the Roman religion was above fate, in a sense. It was something that managed to stand outside, was mother and daughter of gods, and Caesar essentially would follow her in order to stand aside the broken order of fate that had brought to the Roman civil wars, and that he managed to restore in his heroic fashion. So it can be said that between this demon and the normal conscience there exists a relationship that, such as between the identifying and the identified principle. That is, this demon is, according to the teaching of the ancients, a super individual force. It is therefore superior to birth and death. It goes beyond that. And this is important because, as we've seen, it's connected properly to the idea of race and blood, right? Something that belongs to your ancestor that lives on, that gives you that properly that community sense of the importance of the individual as well in these cultures. The latter, instead, is the identified principle, let's say consciousness, conditioned by the body and the external world, let's say what we can essentially assess in a more rationalized form, and is normally destined, in fact, for dissolution or the ephemeral survival proper to shadows, right? So at death, normally this consciousness dies out together with your body. It can remain, like the ancients believed that shadows roamed the world for a while but then would disappear. They were by themselves not endowed by immortality. Whereas, as we will see now, there was a way to surpass this dimension, to enter the demon, and to make something with this, because the demon was ambivalent. It could be both a negative or positive force, and the only way to reach that superior, heroic, essentially semi-divine status, and to obtain immortality in heaven next to the gods, was to tame it. We'll see now. So in the Nordic tradition, the image of the Valkyries has more or less the same meaning as this demon, right? The image of the Valkyria merges in many texts with that of the Filza, spelled Fylgja, right? That is basically the same thing, like it's a spiritual entity acting within man, to whose force his destiny is subjected, at least to a certain degree. And like the Kyn Filza, so Kyn here, I think it's the same etymology of kin properly, the Valkyria is similarly in this sense to the Roman Lares, properly of the one of the individual, but also of the family, etc., the mystical force of blood. So the Kyn Filza is like properly the spiritual force of the clan, like in the Roman Lares. So the same goes for the Fravashi of the Iranian tradition. It's exactly the same thing, and we have there in the iconography, famously enough, the wings. They're not always female, by the way. We will just explain why, and why is probably exactly in the Nordic tradition that this thing remained more female, as it probably was since the beginning. So the Fravashi that we have met recently is the inner strength of every human being, right? Yes, it is something. It's separated conceptually from the same human being, but it is at the same time impossible to detach from him in life, right? This soul sustains him and makes him born and subsist as a living being. And at the same time, the Fravashi, like the Roman Lares, are in contact with the primordial forces of lineage, and are, like the Valkyries, terrifying goddesses of war, who grant luck and victory. Remember the Fortuna Kaiseris, this is exactly the same thing. So this connection is of incredible importance, because we're basically understanding that such mysterious force, representing the deeper soul of the race and the transcendental in the domain of the individual, is basically the same goddess of war. This is an incredibly deep realization. I can't stress how much this connects with modern scientific neurocognitive acquisitions, realizing properly this violent substratum existing within the sense of ourselves. This gets to evolutionary biology, the way we intend life as a struggle, as a competitive endeavor, connected properly with the group as well. So to understand this point better, we looking especially at the Indian and Germanic tradition, let's say we observe properly that there is a that were in a sense more reminiscent, less mitigated than other Indo-European cultures at that point, presenting an aristocratic and differentiated conception of immortality, the one we were saying before, that the idea properly of a divine ascension of the soul, of the hero's soul, through war and self-sacrifice and death to heavens and immortality. Because this is the idea that eventually flowed simply as it was the universal belief at the time, even in Christianity and so on, is that not everyone escapes self-dissolution. You have this Lemuric survival, which Hades and Niflheim are for example, the ancient symbolic images. But immortality, such, is a privilege of the few. And according to the Indo-European conception, mainly a heroic privilege. So surviving not as a shadow in the underworld, right, devoured by the telluric demons, but as a demigod sitting next to the celestial deity in glory, is reserved only for those whom a particular spiritual action has elevated from one nature to another. And here there is a debate that some scholars have brought up relatively to how does this mechanism actually happen, right? But we are factually probably simpler than what the lack of evidence would make us think, but it is connected to the transformation of the individual ego from the normal human consciousness, so the one we operate in right now, that is circumscribed, and identified and limited and transient, into a deeper, super individual force, an identifying one instead, which is beyond birth and death and life itself, and to which we said correspond to the concept of daimon, let's say. And because the daimon at that point gets transformed too by your action itself. So in other words, you elevate yourself above your deeper self, between the forces of nature themselves. So the demon too is beyond all the finite forms in which it manifests itself, because the demon is transfigured and elevated as much as the individual is in the process, right? And the detachment is just at some point properly visualized, as we will see now, in the way it's also represented iconographically, properly the vision of the angel of victory, of the glorious figure that is also associated to death, to war, to the struggle, but that crowns endly the victorious warrior. And this is radical, because you understand that if the demon represents the primordial force of a whole lineage, this lineage also intensifies and elevates itself to a greater status, the one of victory herself, because this is fundamentally what the transfiguration consists in, and victory is just an emanation of divine glory. And it's as if at that point the hero and that glory were one in his soul. So to be worth of it, to be worth of the gods, and that can arrive only through the ultimate sacrifice. And thus the sort of breaking, the sort of, doubling, so that glory manifests itself together with the hero. And so the abrupt transition from ordinary consciousness to such force, symbolized by the demon, consequently does provoke a destructive crisis. This is fundamental, because it cannot happen without it. It's as if a lightning bolt following too high a voltage of potential in the human circuit brought to this achievement. And this can happen under quite exceptional conditions, so that the demon can, in a sense, break into the individual and make him feel a destructive transcendence, because in this case a kind of active experience of death would be aroused properly, and therefore the achievement of that wisdom, that and force at the same time, that is at the base of all the, as you know, the religious military system of this world, where you literally self-sacrifice yourself in the name of the highest glory. And thus also the connection between the demon and the divinity of death in the ancient myths is explained properly as a double image of the same, right? That from one side you see victory, from the other side death. So in the Indo-European worldview, there is no alternative between self-sacrifice and self-dissolution. So this is a choice that we're given in life, right? And in that we always have in potential to fulfill. And so the frightening moment in this is exactly the moment of the self-sacrifice, right? In the Nordic tradition, the warrior sees his own Valkyrie precisely at the instant of death or mortal danger, because this also comes through various degrees, right? If you die, altogether you self-sacrifice, or at least this is subtle, because the self-sacrifice may occur in a broader sense, right? That is the most obvious, and so this is the pushing to an infinite limit that nobody can properly see. It's like properly the idea of transfiguration, the idea of crossing the physical boundaries. So it is not to be meant literally as death in battle per se, because that could occur without this transfiguration, without the heroic deed. Equally, anyhow, the warrior that is approaching danger will be terrified by these figures in the process, and that's when he will prove to be stronger heroically and tamed. And the vision is frightening, not much in a terroristic sense. It is because it has to challenge the warrior, right? It's essentially the warrior challenging himself through the taming of the forces that he awakens from within himself. So in other words, this is the supreme control over oneself, so that your action will be like a godlike one, pure, immediate, completed within itself, without any external conditioning. So this is a religious asceticism, a mortification, a renunciation of one's self, tension in abandonment to God. This is the preferred me, right? This is the the way. There are many ways, actually, also in these mythologies. But this is the most proper. This is the most direct. This is the one, the way of the warrior as the way to the divine, through which one tries precisely to provoke voluntarily the aforementioned crisis and to overcome it positively. In other words, you cannot achieve this if you don't expose yourself to danger and threat and direct responsibility, and you put your life at risk. And in fact, all these expressions are things like mystical death or dark night of the soul, right? It's essentially a passage rite which indicates such condition. And incidentally, this is the same idea underlying the, in fact, passage rites of the warrior brotherhoods that require a degree of such mystical death and essentially rebirth into at least a superior stage in order to be part of such military community. So this is crucial because you understand that you cannot achieve the light if you don't pass through the darkness, and that both things coexist constantly within you. That's why it's your task, existentially your duty, to curb the darker ones with light, but still with the knowledge, the control and the use of the same. Because this is not the diet is there, the struggle between good and evil, but by the extremes, what does factually lay in between, and how can you go from one side to the other if you don't pass through essentially a degree of both? On the other hand, within the framework of a heroic tradition, in fact, the way to the same goal is represented by such active tension. It is in part present in the Dionysian liberation of the element of action. As we were saying, there are some degrees to this. We all, we have to cultivate virtue, starting from the lowest condition. And so, the way to awaken such forces, to even be knowing how to control them, does start from a lowest side. Like in the warrior brotherhoods, also the idea is that essentially when you are reborn into the war band, you are actually not in control of yourself. It's actually the divinity that is in control of you still. Then eventually you're supposed, the wolf warriors and all these things, then just eventually you're supposed to rise through the ranks in the moment in which you demonstrate you're able to dominate those forces, because that will reflect the rising in the process. And so the idea is that to an asymptotic extreme, you not just you never get rid of these forces as long as you're alive, but the idea is that the larger you are spiritually, and the greater the struggle, but at the same time the greater the achievement, which is strikingly accurate in the measure in which we realize how tougher it is to maintain order and functionality and rationality and control, the greater the civilization. Which is incidentally what we instead are undermining at this very point by saying, we achieved a certain situation, so we should stop. No. And that's exactly the illusion of our times. that goes in parallel with the illusion that this has nothing to do with war. So we can say that at the lowest level of such phenomenology, for example, historically, dance, used as a sacred technique to evoke and induce, through the ecstasy of the soul, forces lying in depth. Think about the Thessalians, properly connected to war, and the idea that that priesthood had to fundamentally be a moment, right, in the passage of the Roman imperator, fundamentally, in order to train him, especially as a young man. We have seen it also in the video about Marcus Aurelius, for example, that he was performing these things. And of course that dance was also a physical exercise, right, but primarily, a mental one, because, how do you command your body like, and was connected to knowing how to handle weapons in the process, right? And so in fact that you find in many cultures. But it's very Dionysian, right? It's very dark, telluric. It's a way, in fact, the shamanic trance was induced. If you look at the Iranian peoples of the steppes, even the horse galloping, simulated with drums, etc., was used to induce the state, right? That was proper of the passage ritual, and that was quite often also a pretty bloody affair within itself, right? It's lost in the mist of prehistory, literally meant, but it's obvious that it's connected to the emergence of the basal root of any power in this sense. So the wildes Heer, the Furies, the Erinnys, and other similar spiritual entities dramatize this force in symbolic terms. The deities of the night, the deities of death, right? These were all telluric, chthonic forces that were set up, were staged to properly make you confront yourself with them in order to knowing how to dominate them. And these forces, as you see in the wildes Heer with the Valkyries, the Furies, the Erinnys, these are all women. They're all female. Because they did belong to that metaphysical contraposition to the ideal of virility of war, which, however, cannot be disjuncted, like in everything, between the dichotomy of male and female. So in our way, a way to become men was considered, in this sense, know how to tame these female forces of nature, of the underworld, belonging largely to the pre-Indo-European agricultural sedentary populations, that the Indo-European hero didn't have to fear if he wanted to be a hero in the first place, right, and accomplishing it in the process properly, in fact. And so without them, however, and without their, at this point, acknowledged terrifying character, there couldn't be warriorhood, virility, manhood in the first place, and nevertheless heroism for that matter. But it is interesting in the sense that the same, as we've seen before, that the same female demon that appears transfigures itself and passes from these demonic Furies, Erinnys, but basically they are Dracula's brides in folklore. They are vampires, they are witches, they are all what, of course, the Indo-Europeans first of all began to chase, right? It was not at all a theistic invention. It's pretty ridiculous when people even dare to imagine that this was a thing. And that were, in my opinion, the transposition of the proper subjugation of the pre-Indo-European peoples to bring essentially the women of the, like in the rape of the Sabines by Romulus, etc., to be elevated to the rank of the conquerors, for generating, and so here their connection with the blood and the body, right? The future heroes of the conquerors, right? Kill the men, ingravidate their women. That is fundamentally their deal. These are tribesmen. That's all what they do, right? And so a man who is able to tame those chthonic forces is automatically he who not just elevates himself, but elevates those same forces of humanity for which they are recognized in potential in a world where, really nobody had really explained that also slaves were human beings, by the way. What this means. So there is a universal value of transfiguring potential in an heroic religious military sense that is laying at the root of civilization, which is the scale transposition of the individual improvement to the establishment of civilization itself. So as we've just seen, these furies, these forces correspond to a manifestation of the demon, of oneself demon, in its terrifying and active transcendence. So the sacral war games are, say, a higher level of the process, and higher still stands the war. And there is not much of a difference in between, as you understand, because primarily all of these manifestations in reality are just mirroring the metaphysical struggle that is forever going on between good and evil. And so we're led back to the primordial Indo-European conception of battle and warrior asceticism that is all one with religious belief. So at the height of the danger of heroic combat, the possibility of such supernormal experience was recognized. For example, or if you look at the Latin expression ludere, that is to play, to fight at the same time. This is a Clausewitzian concept, by the way, because the military does correspond in the Trinity to gamble. Well, and the taste properly for unpredictability, which is essentially the realization that there can't be any action of any sort without taking risk, and therefore the highest risk you take, the more you're going to accomplish, which is pretty, spot on, just physically speaking, seem to contain the idea of resolving, of course. And this is one of the many allusions to the property that is inherent in combat of freeing oneself from individual limitations and allowing free forces hidden deep inside to emerge. From here, we can derive a further step that the demons and the lares, the identifying ego, are identical not only to the Furies, to the Erinnings, and other unleashed Dionysian natures, which, for their part, have many traits in common also with the goddess of death, right? Because that's fundamentally the force of the darkness. But they also take on the same meaning with respect to the virgins who lead the assault in battle, to the Valkyries and to the Fravashi. So they are the transfiguration in the extreme. From one side you have the unregulated, irrational, barbaric force that is crushed. From the other, you have pure virtue, unspoiled virtue, symbolized also by the virginity of the Valkyries, etc., that lead the assault in battle, that stand next to the warrior in the moment of the highest proof. Think about properly Germanic warfare. The moment of the charge was fundamentally the single most important one, because they concentrated all in that. So the Fravashi in the Persian tradition are indicated in the texts, for example, as, quote, the terrifying, the omnipotent. Also, quote, those who listen and grant the victory to the one who invokes them. Now, this is really deep, because you understand the religious connection that stands between you and your guardian angel in here. So, the guardian angel that you have to make so. And that is the connection that we have lost, the idea that you have to turn that force into the one that will protect you. And the idea that by invoking them, you will obtain victory from them. And so, in other words, you are evoking those forces and victory itself within yourself. And that's why over the heroic figures in the classical tradition, says you always see the victory above the, I don't know, think the Augustus of Prima Porta with the little genius next to him. It's a little angel. It's the same thing, right? This is also in fact what the Romans venerated, as you know, as the genius of the emperor as such, because that was considered the pure victory given the tenets of the imperium itself. That had been fully accomplished if it had been at the head of the world power in its sacredness, as you understand. So it's of radical importance, because it means that within you there is the potential for everything. And in order to achieve this, you have to fight. There is basically no other way. This is the most complete one, the proper one, the righteous one. That there is no greater victory than self-sacrifice, and no greater accomplishment, and no better consequences than that. Such warrior entities assume in the Indo-European tradition the traits of goddesses of victory, if not victory herself, as essentially an emanation, let's say, a metamorphosis that characterizes precisely the happy fulfillment of the interior experiences of the individual in question. Hence the double meaning of this soul, right? The signification of a profound and super individual power present in its state of latency with respect to ordinary consciousness. So yet another point, that without resuming the sacred in faith and belief and devotion to duty and righteousness and virtue, you cannot awaken these forces. You will be able to awaken them, but not to elevate them, not to improve them, not to transfigure, right? And that is for the chthonic forces of the barbarians, like that the Indo-European order, Uranic, Apollonian in nature, had order in all these cultures. So the Furies and the Erinis reflect a specific manifestation of the demonic unleashing and eruptions, together with the goddesses of death, like the Valkyries, the Fravashi, that appear in the moment of death or of highest danger, referring to the same situations. And they are made possible as such through heroic combat only, so that the goddess of victory is the expression of the triumph of the ego over such power. And this dynamic marks the victorious tension towards a condition situated beyond the danger inherent in ecstasy, and therefore in the subpersonal forms of destruction. A danger is always lurking behind the frenetic moment of Dionysian and even heroic action itself, because as we have already explained, you never quite detach yourself from these darker forces within yourself. If this was possible in life, you would essentially stop struggling, and therefore you could not fulfill your heroic duty to the extreme of self-sacrifice. And at the same time, you cannot quite achieve this if you don't expose yourself first to such frenzy, to such conditions that are apparently not advisable, but without which you could not elevate yourself at all. So this is the value of experience, and think how true this is in combat. So the impetus, in all its ambivalent appearance in this sense, towards a spiritual state, a truly superpersonal one, which makes free, mortal, entirely indestructible, the so-called becoming one of the two. Right, so the two elements of the human essence, your conscience and your deeper soul, is thus expressed in such representation of mythical consciousness. So this it's important to investigate even properly under the light of our awareness of the human mind, because these are all things that return properly in psychoanalysis, in behavior. We see that the whole concept of meaning is fundamentally founded in this idea, and it's pretty damn accurate. That is to say, these people, thousands of years before Christ even, already knew how the mechanism worked, and they did because they lived lives in a radically more intense way than we do, and so they were perfectly aware by sheer experience, without even the need of rationalizing this, so that you find just a myth, not in a laid out modern explanation. But it's our problem. We can't read this, but just by studying mythology, that is their voice, right? Their culture telling us it's something that essentially we are told from a world where this was done, for us today to understand that this is to be done. So if you therefore look at this dominant message in the primordial heroic traditions of those peoples, you understand that, of course, victory has a mystical meaning. And the fundamental premise is that an effective correspondence between physical and metaphysical, between visible and invisible, was conceived, where the actions of the spirit manifest super-individual traits and are expressed through real operations and facts. And such spiritual realization is based on the perceived relation between the secret soul and warlike action in its most authentic form, the crowning of which lies in actual victory. Then, the material aspects of military victory become an expression of the spiritual action that brought about victory, at the point where exterior and interior connect, which is a way to reinforce the direct connection between cause and consequence and subordinating it to individual control. In other words, the hero is expressing a super responsibility, is carrying an enormous burden to achieve the greatest of feats. Hence, there is no space for moral relativism in all of this. There is no laziness, there is no, whataboutism, there is no idea of, I don't care just, or I don't understand, or any excuse is destroyed, together with the lowest forms of spiritual inferiority. Victory over oneself appears as a tangible sign for a consecration to a mystical rebirth that takes place in the same moment. The furies and death which the warrior, in this sense, faces materially on the battlefield, because whatever you see is it, right? It's fury, it's death, it's the most horrifying spectacle that you can imagine, are opposing him internally on the spiritual level. That the forces of light, self-control, and virtue manage to push back. In the form properly of a menacing eruption of the primordial forces of his being. And this is also a Clausewitzian concept, because without those primordial forces, those are yet another element of the Trinity, including hatred, enmity, right? You cannot quite achieve. And if you're not motivated in that sense, if you do not learn how to control the forces of nature, you cannot hope to stand against them even. This is the deeper wisdom, that you can turn into something terrifying yourself in the way you ruthlessly achieve that goal, right? If you where the warrior triumphs over these forces, victory belongs to him, because he has the best of those forces from his side. And that's why idleness and moral relativism and weakness and all these things are simply nothing. People try to escape responsibility by saying, it's not my fault, I didn't do anything. Like, that's the way you're working for evil. That's the way you're letting it happen. That's the way nothing will change because of you. So that when things will come to wipe you out, you will dissolve into nothingness, because nothing you did. And for no reason you will be remembered for. So this framework explains, by the way, also why in the work connected to tradition, every victory assumes a sacred meaning whatsoever. So nothing is really left to chance by itself, because even in case in which there are inferior forces that are struggling, in the moment they are more intense, they can take over. So if it wasn't the case, the struggle between more good and evil wouldn't even need to exist. So you cannot exclude that this clash can end through defeat in a way, but there is a difference in the way you get defeated, and you can achieve full victory in that sense, even by being killed. And for example, the dukes of the Roman army acclaimed on the battlefields offered the experience and presence of that mystical force that had transformed him, had transfigured him. That's literally, he took on, during the triumph, Jupiter's aspect to render it back on the altar of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus in Rome, and somebody whispering him always on the chariots, "Well, remember though that you are only a mortal, so that it's never over, that you haven't accomplished anything that cannot be reversed equal. Any moment in which you lose that knowledge, you lose control of the inner forces of yourself, and you let them take over in the darkest forms again." So the profound meaning of the otherworldly character emerging from the glory and the divinity of the victor becomes understandable, as we've just seen for example, in the ancient Roman celebration of triumph, that assumes, in fact, more a sacred than a military feature, because frankly there was no difference. On the contrary, the full sacredness actually was considered as, like in that case, as the fulfillment of the military accomplishment. After all, it is reestablishing order and clarity and light over a world dominated by obscure forces. So victory is represented by that absence of perturbance. But it's not to be confused. It's like the concept of the Friede that we have made also a video on. Like it's probably the Germanic idea of peace, that is peace in arms, that is maintained because, if anything, the deterrent capacity to put an end immediately to any kind of threat, which is something we have to learn to do quite well again, or at least that we don't, in fact, have used enough in front of the demonic forces outside of our culture in this world. And the recurring symbolism in the primordial Indo-European traditions of the Victories, the Valkyries, and similar entities, which guide the warrior's soul to the sky, literally, because eventually that's the same idea of the angel, that it's your own. You see in the Disney cartoons where the character dies and the angel, self, actually flies to the sky. That's the concept. That's the idea that at that point you will go to heaven because you have achieved that coherence, internal fulfillment with your own duty towards yourself and the world. Well, the other thing can go the other way around. You can be swallowed by the monsters of the underworld and remain tormented forever into a mess that doesn't make any sense and dissolve into it. So the same goes for the myth of the victorious hero, that if you look at the Doric Heracles, when he obtains, for example, from Nike, so the goddess of victory, the crown that makes him a partaker of Olympic indestructibility. We have seen this in the video about the rise and fall of Hellenic civilization, that in the oldest Doric ideal there is probably the most radical expression of such Olympic superpower from the side of a hero, right? So a demigod, actually. And this symbolism can be observed in its lower degrees of manifestation, given to the common individual through the explanation of this mechanism as we have illustrated today. So mystical theology here is expressed by poetry, rhetoric, fairy tales, and so on. Essentially teaches that thus the sanctifying spiritual transfiguration takes place in glory. And Christian iconography surrounds the heads of saints and martyrs with the halo of glory. right? So all this points to a legacy, surely a weakened one of some sort, but still of the probably of the highest heroic tradition in a military sense. In fact, if you look at the Indo-European tradition already, and you know about the celestial fire, and this stood as glory, right? It was the celestial principle, right, of divine power, properly, the fire, the kraveno, which descends on kings and military leaders, right, and makes them immortal. And for them it bears witness in victory. And this is the pure perfection, the highest of the highest kind, right? Only if you only tell a lie, divine glory will fly away of you, and you will remain in misery. And the ancient, radiated royal crown, of course, symbolizes, and precisely so, glory as solar and celestial fire. So light, solar splendor, glory, victory, divine royalty are all the same image that reappears from Indo-European past in closest connection, and not in terms of an abstraction or invention, but in the meaning of absolutely real forces and dominions. What do you think any power at the time was based on? It was a pure military religious idea at a totalizing level, from the Achaemenids to Rome to the Christian Empire. And so in this context, when you look at the mystical doctrine of struggle and victory, well, you see that properly the shining apex of our common conception of action in the deepest and truest and highest sense of our tradition. Keep on fighting and never surrender.